Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 2 of our coverage of the 2020 Candidates Tournament. Winner of this tournament does go on to face Magnus Carlsen later in this year for the World Championship. Our competitors today, white's going to be played by Fabiano Caruana, the only American in the field. He's the highest rated player that we have here. Second in the world only to Magnus Carlsen. He won the Candidates 2 years ago and then did lose to Magnus Carlsen later in that year for the World Championship. In round 1, he tied against MVL. He's going to be looking to get on the board with a decisive victory with the white pieces. His opponent today playing the black pieces, and that is Kirill Alekseenko. This is the youngest player as well as the lowest rated player in the tournament. So definitely an opportunity for Fabiano to get on the board. But from black's perspective, definitely an opportunity for the youngster to go off against the highest rated player in the tournament and see what he can do. Fabiano starts out with d4, and then after knight to f6, c4, e6, knight to c3, we get into the Nimzo Indian. Always a opening that we don't see too much from white anymore. A lot of times after the bishop takes here on c3, we see the pawn capture here, double pawns here. Just not something we see all too often from white, because black just has a lot of good lines that they can go down. But Fabiano definitely in preparation, saying, yeah, this is the opening I want to go down against this opponent. And then plays f3. And this is the most common way that you'll see whites responding to the Nimzo Indian defense, preparing for e4, preparing to dominate the center of the board with the pawns. If the bishop takes here, that's completely fine. Going to be looking, you can see the dominance of the center with the pawn. So that's kind of what Fabiano is thinking if black decides to take here on c3. First, we see pawn come down here to d5, says, yeah, I got to disrupt the center of the board. I can't let you just dominate everything right here. a3, and then the bishop comes back here to e7. Not the most common move that you typically see here. Bishop takes on c3 is the most common, but we do have Fabiano actually played a bishop back here to e7 in a match 2019, so not too long ago, and crushed one of the top players in the world. So anytime you have a recent game with a variation that doesn't see all that much play and they have a decisive victory, that's something a lot of players will look at and say, okay, maybe this bishop to e7 makes a lot of sense. My guess is that went into some of the preparation that black had, but that's exactly what he played. Bishop here to e7, and then e4, continuing the plan that Fabiano has to control the center of the board with his pawns. Black takes here on e4. We do see the exchange with the pawns, and you can see Fabiano's setup has the 3 pawns in the center of the board. He does have a little weakened king side, but once he castles on the king side at some point if he wants to, it's very similar to a King's Gambit accepted line where the rook is here on f1, controls this semi-open file, and can have a pretty strong attack against his opponents. From here we do see c5, just trying to break up the center of the board here. d5, and then the exchange on board here. And Fabiano has a pretty aggressive pawn on d5. Once you can get your pawn to your opponent's 5th rank here, and then you have support from your own pawn. That's always a good setup here. Castle on the king side, and then bishop to e2. Couple options here from Fabiano. He's definitely going to be looking to get his knight involved here to f3 at some point and his bishop to e2 instead of knight to f3, which I think is pretty common as well. Decides to start with bishop here to e2. Rook here to e8, knight up here to f3, bishop down to g4, pinning down the knight to the bishop. Castle on the king side, as we talked about, this wants to get kingside safety, also wants to make sure that his rook has a pretty aggressive line that he can start to attack on. Knight to d7, just holding down the fort for the knight here on f6. Also just no other square can't come here to c6. It's being attacked by the pawn on d5. Definitely a nuisance that black has to deal with. And then d6, and this is a pretty interesting move from Fabiano. We're in move number 13. So this is definitely in his preparation. One of the moves that they look at. So after a tournament, they do interviews with the players and they ask him different setups, and this is one that they asked him about because it's a pretty bold strategy. You have a good setup here. You have central control with your pawns. This pawn's protecting this pawn right here, the knight here on c3. Nice central setup for Fabiano. Anytime you push it forward, no longer has pawn control. This pawn here on c5 is not doing anything. Now you have to start to defend that with your other pieces. Your queen here, you can eventually get your knight up here to b5 and protect that. You can get your bishop, dark square bishop here to f4 and protect that. But it's no longer protected by the pawns, and it's pushing a little further than you're used to seeing. But Fabiano definitely in his preparation felt like this was the opportunity to push forward, did not want his opponent bringing his bishop here to d6, and started wanting to attack his opponent right away. Bishop comes back here to f8, definitely not the spot you want your bishop to go to, but don't have any other squares for it to go to. h3, forcing the bishop to come back here to h5. Does not want to give the bishop up right away, especially in an open board state. Bishops tend to do better. And then knight up here to b5. Now this is move 15 on the board, and Fabiano said his team prepared for this specific position. So if you ever hear players talk about they're preparing for tournaments and specific openings and variations, they get extremely in-depth. Fabiano said this very specific position his team was prepared for and was trying to get to. Now you're assuming your opponent is going very specific moves. You gotta assume that he's gonna play that Vichy Anand bishop back to e7 early on. Now they have strategies depending on wherever they go, but to look at this position, say this is exactly what we're going for. It's pretty cool to see Fabiano have that preparation, then actually play it out on the board. This puts his opponent in a pretty tough spot because he is threatening the knight up here to c7. And this is forking both the rooks right here. And so how does Black really respond? And Black spent 30 minutes on this move, so definitely not an easy position, trying to figure out the best way. At the end of the day, chose rook to e6. Both Fabiano and Kirill looked at this and said afterwards, probably not the best move. A couple options instead of rook to e6. One would be queen to b6. The other one would be a rook here to b8. Looking those both real quick. If queen to b6, if the knight came up here to c7, yes, attacking both of the rooks right here. But then the bishop takes. After the knight takes, then the rook takes here. Maybe knight up here to h4. Could see an exchange on board. Black's going to be in, a decent shape. White definitely came up with a rook advantage, and Black gave up, the rook in exchange for a minor piece and a pawn. If instead of the queen coming here to b8, the other option that they looked at would be for this rook to come to b8. Because now if the knight came to c7, then you could see the rook just take here on e2. After the queen takes, bishop takes here on d6. And then maybe the knight comes back to b5 here. Bishop comes down to g3. But then if the knight takes on a7, which doesn't have to, could stay on this b5 square, but if it does, then all of a sudden Black has a pretty aggressive setup. Yes, gave up some material here, but you can see both these knights, the bishop, all attacking on the king side. Queen can easily get involved into the game. So those are the options that they looked at. But on the board state, it played rook to e6, and it seemed like he was just trying to stop knight to c7, which this absolutely does, because rook taking here on d6, it shuts it all down. This knight can't take here on a8 because the queen would fall here on d1. So it absolutely stops that. Not necessarily the best move that he had in this position. Fabiano very quickly played bishop to f4, said he was pleased to see rook to e6. He was prepared for queen coming here to b6 or rook here to b8. That's what his team said, because he was already preparing for bishop to f4. So since he's kind of forced to do this, he said that was in my preparation as well. a6, forcing the knight to move. Knight comes up here to c7, attacking the rook. Rook comes down to e4 here, since this knight's attacking both of the rooks. Decides to go ahead and bring his bishop back here. He has a great spot with his knight right here. Not looking to do anything, doesn't want to give up his bishop quite yet. Square here on h2 is a fantastic square. Really wants to control this pawn here on a d6. He feels like that's the most critical square on the board right here. outpost for his knight right here. Both his queen and his bishop are eyeing down to defend that square. Remember, his pawn is not able to protect it, so has to make sure he uses his other pieces. Black, rightfully so, trying to attack that. Even if he has some awkward exchanges, wants to get that bishop off the board. Now the rook comes over here to c8 since it was under attack here. Pawn up here to g4, forcing the bishop to do something, either retreat or exchange, and black goes all in, decides to take that material after the pawn recaptures. Knight takes here on a g4. So all the pawns in front of Fabiano's king side are gone, but he's also giving up some material right here in exchange. Now, this really not much else black can do here. Doesn't have the best setup, so has to try to make something happen, but it's not clear how he's going to start getting all his pieces involved into the game to start to attack his opponent and actually win this game. Bishop to d3, attacking the rook right here. Black decides, let's go ahead and start gobbling out material. Bishop takes here on e4. Very important that Fabiano captures correctly. If he captures with his knight right here, that would be a huge mistake because the queen can come down to g5, and then king to h1, rook over here to h4. Same thing as if he were to capture with his king. King takes on h2. Now bishop to d6 check. Awkward spot here. Knight to f6. Bishop takes, but now the queen down here to d7 check. So you don't want to have your king exposed right here. The knight on f3, definitely want to make sure that it is stopping the queen coming up here to g5. So that's why I decided to go ahead and take with his bishop here on e4, giving up his rook here on f1. So that's completely okay with me. Queen swings over here and recaptures on f1. Now the bishop takes on d6, and then the knight comes back here to d5. So I had the outpost here on b5 for a while. Can't go back there because the pawn on a6. d5 is just as good, really controlling the center of the board. Both sides equal in material as far as point-wise. One minor piece is worth about 3 pawns in material, but you can really tell that Fabiano has a lot more aggressive pieces controlling the center. This queen and rook, it's going to be very difficult for them to attack with anything more than themselves. Where Fabiano, you can look at it, the bishop's already attacking this pawn right here, can easily start to get the other knight involved into the game. This knight here on d5 is much better placed than the knight back here on d7. Can swing his rook over and get involved into the action. So I'm not saying it's an overwhelming position for Fabiano, but definitely has the upper hand just as far as an active board state. Then we see g6, h3 just starting to attack on the king side of the board. G7, king here to h1. So a couple things with this. One, he wants to make sure that he gets his king off the dark squares. When you get into the end game, you want to look at the threats that your opponent has, and one of those threats is this dark square bishop. So there could be some discover attacks if maybe the bishop came down here to h2. Just doesn't want to have to worry about that. So the bishop no longer is a threat to this king. Also, the only other threat is if the queen comes down at some point to d5, which it can't. One, because it's being protected by the pawn here on c4. But now this entire diagonal is pretty much safe for the king. It could eventually come to c6, but the first move that it would have to come to is d5 if it wants to attack. It would have to have a couple moves before it could come to c6. White could respond in that fashion. So h1 is a pretty safe square, even though there's no pawns in front of it. Now the knight comes down to e5, attacking the knight. Fabiano says, I need all my material. This is extremely valuable to me. So he brings his knight over here to h4. Then the pawn comes down to h5. Would be a mistake to play knight takes on c4. You can see the action starting to go to the king side of the board. If you watched my videos before, it's all about having the material involved into the game. Knight coming back to c4. Yes, it gets a pawn, but that's not what the game is about. This would be a huge mistake because after knight to f5 check, no real good way for black to continue. If the pawn takes here, this eventually would lead to checkmate. It's a pretty extensive checkmate here, but after rook to g1, there's no real way for black to hold on to this. If instead he doesn't take right away, maybe king to h8, This is going to be bad as well. Rook over here to f1. Maybe the pawn takes here, but this is still going to be completely fine for white. He could take material here. He can swing his rook over, but at the end of the day, he's probably going to take it with his bishop right now. It's going to end well for Fabiano. So, as you can imagine, decides not to take this pawn. That's not what he should be doing. He plays h5. Not necessarily the best move either, but he just doesn't have too many options as far as getting his material where he needs it to be. Rook swings over here to g1. So everything we wanted Fabiano to be doing as far as the setup, that's exactly what he's doing. He understands this position. Remember, he was preparing for that specific setup on move number 15. That all leads to just a few different end games that he would expect to see, this being one of them. So he knows exactly how to get his material over to the king side, start to attack his opponents. Now the bishop comes back to f8. That's definitely not doing anything productive in all honesty. But again, there's not too many great moves for black to go to. Knight to f4, putting a lot of pressure on the square g6 here, but the bishop, the two knights, and the rook here all eyeing down on that pawn on g6. Knight to g4, it's an outpost, also blocking some material right here, the rook attacking the pawn. That's okay, Fabiano says, I have other plans here. I'm going to go ahead and take your pawn here on h5. After the pawn takes, a bishop here to f5. That's being protected by the knight on h4, attacking both the knight and the rook up here. Bishop comes to e7, just moving back. It's not really doing too much. Bishop takes here on g4. After the pawn takes, queen takes on g4. You can see things are going down pretty quickly for black here. Bishop to g5, and then queen up here to h5. And there's just no way to stop all of the threats here. Eventually, you could see knight to f5 check. You could see the rook come up here to g5 as well. It's now being protected by the queen. The bishop can't really move because it's being pinned down by the rook. So all in all, it's just all bad. And you can even see that the queen, it would really like a perpetual check. The only way to do that is if it were to come down and attack on d5, which we talked about. It's protected by the pawn here on c4. So white just doing everything right in the game. In this spot, black decided to resign. So congratulations to Fabiano on getting the victory in game number 2. We now have a 4-way tie, so 8 competitors, 4 players tied at the top with 1.5 points, which means they have 1 victory and 1 draw. Fabiano at the top here, tied with 1.5 points. We have Jan Nepo, we have MVL, and then we have Hao Wang. He won the first game against Dingler, and he drew today. So those 4 competitors are all tied at the top, but Fabiano, drawing against MVL, which, as expected, first game, very strong opponent there, and then coming back and winning the game that he pretty much needed to win. The lowest rated player, you have the white pieces, you got to come out and win. He executed his plan flawlessly. It was really cool to see him both execute and then watch him in the interview, analyzing the board, talking about how it was executed exactly how he planned it. So really, really cool to see. Happy for him. Hopefully he can continue going on and hopefully go on to win the tournament. Thank you guys so much for watching round number 2. Again, nothing else going on in the world, so hopefully you guys are tuning in here. And we will be back tomorrow for round number 3 of the Candidates Tournament.